Hello. We're good? Hi, everyone. Thanks. So I guess we'll start. My name is Ken Wong, and I'm a lead designer at ustwo Games. I worked on Monument Valley. There's a hashtag there if you want to tweet about us. And you might have noticed that when you walked into the room, your badges were scanned. That's so that the conference can email you afterwards, and hopefully you can give me some feedback about my presentation. So thank you all for coming to hear me talk. Earlier this year, we released this game called Monument Valley for iOS and Android. What we think is really special about this game is that it kind of breaks a lot of game conventions and tropes. There's nothing to kill in this game. You can't collect or upgrade or buy or build anything. There's very little choice. It's actually a very linear game. It's also not very challenging, and it's not very long. It's quite a short game. And at a time when most mobile games are freemium, we decided to sell our game for $4. So it's quite unusual, and yet it's become one of the most successful mobile games this year. And some people don't even call it a game. They say it's more of an experience. And that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. This notion of, here's something that the games industry made that's less of a game, but more of an experience. And what does that mean? In making this game, I think we were really forced to deconstruct what it is our industry makes. And I think the lessons that we learnt on this project can really help shape the future of our industry, especially for games that are trying to be beautiful or personal or meaningful. So I started my career in the games industry as a freelance concept artist way back in 2001. And that led me to my first full-time job as an art director at Enlight Games in Hong Kong. A few years after that, in 2007, I moved to Shanghai, where I was art director of Alice Managed Returns. And I was there for a few years before I decided to take a break from living in China and from working in the studio system to go make a game by myself using Unity. So I upgraded my programming skills, and I taught myself how to animate, and I read everything that I could about making and marketing mobile games, indie games. And the result was Hacky Cat, which is a game that's like hacky sack, but with cats. And during this whole time, I've kept up work as a digital illustrator, sometimes working for clients and other times doing work just for myself. So I've kind of had a speciality on the art side and art direction, but I've done a little bit of everything in games. And it's with this experience that I joined ustwo at the start of last year. ustwo has about 180 employees across 3 studios, Malmo, New York, and London. In the London office, there are about 100 of us, and of those, 8 of us develop games, own IP games full-time. The rest of the people make digital products, apps, and other UX products. UX is short for user experience, which is a term that increasingly finds itself into games. And so this is how the games team found itself surrounded by all these amazing, talented, digitally savvy, creative people who own mobile devices but don't necessarily play games, right? And we think this had 2 effects on the way that we made games. The first is that we thought about UX a lot, right? I would say that UX is about thinking about products in terms of how they're used from the user's point of view rather than as isolated objects or systems. It's this notion that the way that we interact with computers is just as important as computing itself. And the second effect that this had on us is that we realized that there are so many people out there who just don't play games for whatever reason. And so, embedded in this studio, if we wanted to make something that the rest of the company could understand and be proud of and enjoy and be able to play, we would have to maybe approach games in a different way. We had this really fortunate situation where the people in charge said to us, don't worry about the money. We have confidence that you guys can be profitable in the long term. Just focus on making a really amazing mobile game. And this is a tremendous privilege because so many studios, so many people who are in mobile gaming, they're worried about where their money's coming from, and they're trying to acquire as many users as possible. So with all this freedom, it's like, well, what more is there than money and popularity? What is it that our team is trying to achieve with this opportunity? So I want to put this question aside for a little while and ask another question. What is it that the games industry makes? Obviously, we make games, things that resemble sports and board games and card games, games of skill, games of chance. And I would say that the defining thing about games is mechanics, these things like rules and systems and numbers. However, we know that sometimes what our industry makes actually resembles film or books more, perhaps even something like a walk through a museum or traveling to an exotic place. And when people talk about these non-games, a word that they often use is experience. So, and I think that the defining thing about this is aesthetics and semantics. So where these games rely on mechanics, these other experiences focus more on story, on character, on art, sound. So I want to talk about how these two things both reside within our industry. And I don't think it's a case of any individual work is trying to achieve both and is trying to maximize both of those things. I think it's more about a proportion of where the enjoyment comes from. So some people, they like to play computer and video games for the mechanics side. They're trying to show their skill and improve on their skills in order to overcome challenges. Some of that might be related to trying to beat opponents. There's an aspect of risk and reward, making judgments about that. And, there may also be an aspect of completionism about, trying to collect everything in the game. On the other hand, some other people are not concerned with trying to get as good at the game as possible. Perhaps they're engaging in computer and video games because they're in search of good stories or interesting characters. Maybe they're there for the sensory experience, great art, great sound, music, or just the novelty of strange, new, amazing things and being immersed in these amazing interactive fantasy universes. I think an example of a video game that is really mechanics heavy, really centered, where the enjoyment comes from the mechanics is Pong. There's no story in Pong that I'm aware of. It has barely any graphics and sound. So most of the reason why people play Pong is the mechanics. On the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, I think something like Dear Esther, there's barely anything to do. You just walk around an island. But the story that is told and the way that visuals and audio are used, that's what forms the experience. And there's nothing to say that one is better than the other. They're just two different approaches to how we use our tools and how we use our medium to create things for the user. I actually think that the majority of games come somewhere in the middle, right? The enjoyment comes from a combination of mechanics and aesthetics and or semantics. I think there is a tendency for game developers, gamers, and the game media to overemphasize mechanics. The idea that the mechanics form the core of the game or the soul of the game, and that story and art are kind of this dressing up or this distraction from that. But I think that there's a lot of people that, you know, for them that's the important part of the game, or it's a defining part of the game. And these ratios that I'm showing here, they're kind of subjective. You know, this is how I see things. You may play games for different reasons and maybe make a different analysis on individual games. I think an interesting analogy for this difference is mazes and labyrinths. The difference between a maze and a labyrinth is that a maze has multiple paths. There's one true path from the entry to the exit, to the goal. But there are so many dead ends. The maze is trying to defeat you. It's trying to keep you lost, and you're trying to beat it, right? Whereas in a labyrinth, there's only one path. There's no choice. It's and sometimes there are no walls in a labyrinth. It's just a line on the ground, and you can see everything in front of you. So walking a labyrinth is not about trying to beat it. That's pretty simple. It's just about what you're thinking and feeling as you walk this path. Now, some of you might be quite satisfied making games the way that we have for a long time and thinking a lot about mechanics. And I think that's fine. That's great. I'm not insisting that we all gravitate towards the other side. But I think there's a lot of benefits to creating experiences, or at least thinking about games in terms of experiences. So I think we're all doing it anyway. You know, as I said, most of the games what we call games, what most of them are experiences in some way. They involve art or story or characters. So I think at the very least it provides a different perspective about what we do. If you're interested in creating meaning, I think at sometimes mechanics can actually get in the way of trying to deliver meaning. So experiences can be a better way of doing that. I do believe that there's a really large audience out there who, for them, the mechanics focus excludes them, right? They're not good enough at the game, or they just don't have the patience to do things over and over again until they get it right. And so there are wide audiences out there that I don't think are catered enough for, and they're willing to pay for these experiences. We can use all the same tools that we use to make mechanics-focused games, and the same distribution methods. But at the same time, I think thinking about games in terms of experiences allows us to use the storytelling tools of linear mediums like film and books, maybe without trying to force them to be interactive. If you think about the way that games like Grim Fandango and Final Fantasy use cinematics and dialogue in a non-interactive way, that's so powerful, right? They don't feel like they're forced to wrap that around mechanics all the time. And because there are so few teams doing this, you know, like only recently have we really had a lot more tools and a lot more ability to create these. There's not many people pushing these boundaries. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for innovation. It's a less competitive space. I also think that it might be the key to virtual reality. You know, VR is about immersing yourself in a different environment. It's about this sensory experience. And I think a lot of the great VR demos that have been made so far in these early days they're about experiences, not so much mechanics. One of the questions that we get asked a lot about Monument Valley is, where did we get the idea from? And I think a lot of it has to do with this game called Windowsill. It's originally a Flash game made by one guy called Vector Park, and it was later ported to iPad. And when my colleague introduced this game to me at the start of last year, before we'd started work on Monument Valley, it was a bit of a revelation to me. Here's a game that's not about violence, not about collecting. You don't get 3 stars for anything. You just guide this little car to the exit by tapping and swiping on weird stuff in the background and kind of watching how these beautiful animations unfold and just the joy of interacting with the things on the screen. Just interacting, that's the main mechanic. And I thought that was fascinating, that you know, this focus on just the visuals and just simple delight and surprise. Because of that, we could leave behind all of these kind of tropes and cliches that I think maybe exclude some people from games. Also, for a long time, I'd wanted to make a game about architecture. Now, architecture plays a part in many, many games, if not most games. But it's often the backdrop. It's often a stage for characters and their stories and their interactions. I wanted to see if I could make a game where architecture played the main character. And so I came across this picture, Ascending and Descending, by MC Escher. And I thought, this could be a game if I could guide a character from the bottom of the building through the building, maybe by solving some puzzles, by moving the architecture up to the highest point. You know, that could be a game. That maybe that's enough. So this idea, in combination with sort of the experience, a very short experience, Windowsill. You can finish it in about 30 minutes. The combination of these two things is what formed the spark of what became Monument Valley. So this all happened at the start of last year as we were trying to come up with new ideas for what our next project would be. And with my background in illustration and concept art, the way that I pitch ideas is through imagery. Sometimes it's a storyboard or a diagram. In this case, it was a single illustration. This was the first bit of Monument Valley concept art, which I'm quite proud of because it actually resembles the final game quite closely. And I printed out this piece of art along with a bunch of other ideas that I had, and I put them on a wall at the studio. And other colleagues from outside the team and visitors to the studio would walk by, and they would make comments and ask questions like, "What's that? You know, what's that game about?" And this image got a really good response. You know, people asked questions. It was approachable. It didn't look like a computer game. It looked like a piece of art. But it kind of told a story in its structure. And there was enough there to warrant a bit more exploration. So I did more concept art and tried to explore what this world could be and actually playing with impossibility, like impossible geometry. And I experimented with adding text, kind of inspired by posters, which ended up in the game in the form of the chapter introductions and the way the storyteller ghost talks. We sourced inspiration from a really wide range of sources. I found myself gravitating towards these images of complex little worlds floating in space. And sometimes they were literally like levels. They were buildings or mountains or islands, places that you could explore. Other times they were more like diagrams or just shapes. But I thought it was really interesting having these kind of compositions where you could imagine that whole thing is one place that you could explore. I think there's something really comforting about seeing the whole world at once, like a map. It's finite, it's manageable. Everything that you need to solve the problem is right there in front of you, contained in this beautiful little arrangement. But all of these ideas and this concept art, that's not as good as a playable prototype. So here's the very first demos that we made for Monument Valley. They were actually playable on iPad. There's a mouse cursor here because we're sort of emulating it after the fact. And, you know, testing this on colleagues, this is what let us know that we really had something. Very, very old and crude by our final standards. So I'd like to try and describe at this point, at this early point after this exploration, what we thought the Monument Valley experience was. We never had a design document for Monument Valley. Our team is only 8 people, so we can communicate pretty directly with each other without so much need for documents. The working prototypes, it was much more useful, you know, like everything was right in there. If we had an idea, we would just try it out and put it on the iPad and try that with audiences. And that was so powerful because the iPad is so approachable. You know, people are unafraid to come over to an iPad, pick it up and start tapping, especially when it looks like this. You know, the whole game idea, the premise, the instructions, it's all already in the art. So first of all, you know, we knew that this game would hinge around beautiful visuals. And this would help us stand out in the App Store. You know, a unique art style, something that would pique your interest from the very first impression. We make mobile games at ustwo. And, you know, one of the very simple rules is that you don't try to create something that you have to force with another control scheme. We wanted to make something that was touch-based, that was native to the iPad. So we actually put a lot of effort into the control scheme, into figuring out how to make that a really intuitive touch experience. We theorized that getting the character, Ida, to the top of these monuments, that was enough, right? People felt really good just to achieve that, and they could work that out by themselves. Just like windowsill, if that was enough, it would negate the need to create artificial rewards like achievements or 3-star systems or a scoring system or completion times. We had this approach to make every level unique so that every time a player went into a level, they would expect something fresh and new. And this is kind of counter to a lot of game design. You know, many games have this attitude where every time you introduce a mechanic, you try and milk that for as long as you can and stretch it over as many levels as possible. We thought, you know what, we're just going to just do the best puzzles and focus our time and attention on that. We thought that we would go a bit old school and try to not hold the player's hand too much. We thought that if the players could work out how to do this by themselves, you know, using the architecture and the art to give hints to them, that they could work out what to do for themselves, and that would be more rewarding. And this extended to not instructing the player what to feel, either through animations or musical score. We thought that if players would empathize of their own will with Ida and put themselves in her shoes, that this could make the emotional impact much more powerful. We had the approach to not have a constructed story in mind that we were trying to tell to the player and worry about whether they were going to understand that or follow that. We thought that storytelling in games could be perhaps more like music. I think music can tell a story, but it's not literal and exact. it's lyrical and tonal, and is kind of open to interpretation. So that means that the player has to kind of make up for their own minds what the story is about. And I think that's actually really fitting to our interactive medium. Lastly, with all of this emphasis on quality over quantity and beauty and story and not giving people cheap thrills, there was no version of this game in our minds that would work through freemium or be ad-supported or surrounded by in-app purchase. So we thought that from the start that this was going to be a premium-priced app. I think there is over a tendency in our industry to think about games in terms of individual mechanics, you know, cover mechanics and multiplayer and state-of-the-art AI and enemy spawning and all these kinds of things. And also to think of games in terms of genres, like RPGs and FPS and point-and-click adventure, which I think just serves to reinforce stereotypes and cliches. I think it's much more interesting to ask these two questions about your game. What is your game about, and what do you do? I think if you can answer these two questions, maybe not to the public, but at least to yourself in an interesting way, then you're on the right path to creating something that's more individual, more personal, more unique. So in my mind, my answers are that Monument Valley is about impossible architecture, geometry, and if you really pay attention, forgiveness. And what you do in Monument Valley is you guide a princess to the top of buildings by manipulating architecture. So that's kind of like the overall design of the Monument Valley experience. This design process was ongoing. You know, we never really kind of leveled out at a fixed design and like, this is what we're going to make. It kept evolving. And we based creating levels, you know, on that design, but then the results from drafting these levels fed back into what the design was. We started by coming up with a list of ideas for levels. So rather than like Ice World and Fire World and Grass World, the ideas for Monument Valley levels were impossibilities, things that couldn't happen, or they were based on introducing new types of interaction, like rotating, dragging. Other levels were based on geometric ideas. So, for example, the descent is an upright triangle followed by a downwards triangle. Still other levels introduced new characters for Ida to interact with. The Crow People and the companion character, which became known as the Totem. And in these early days, we did a whole bunch of sketching on paper, trying to think in 3D and 2D at the same time, and also like how these levels would morph around. So we have like pages and pages of this madness. We used Unity engine because we really wanted to dive in and experiment and be able to try new ideas without worrying about failing, basically. And, you know, the Unity engine was great for allowing artists like me to become level designers and to add simple scripts. Over time, we added our own tools to the engine to kind of to make our process faster, of adding navigation nodes and fixing the cameras and doing all sorts of magical stuff. We also developed tools to go from our what we call the white box version of the level to the vised version of the level. The white box version is kind of made of cubes and basic building blocks. It kind of looks a bit ugly, but you can kind of tell the composition from there. But importantly, it's very, very easy to iterate. You know, we can just dive in there, move a couple of things around, and then test that straight away. The vised version, on the other hand, is optimized and beautiful and works well on device. So despite all these grand visions and designs and what we thought was pretty good planning, as time was running out, we had to face some pretty tough decisions about, what we could actually fit into the game by our deadline. And but I also think that making these tough decisions really helped Monument Valley become, a final product. At ustwo, we put a lot of emphasis on user testing. User testing is different from focus testing. With the focus group, you kind of ask them questions and, what did you like and what did you not like? Did you like this character? And I think you take on board that feedback and put that in the design process. With user testing, we would watch people play the game, trying to simulate what a real situation was like and not speak to them. We wouldn't give them any hints, no instructions other than what was in the game. And we'd just watch and see where they got frustrated and where they were having fun. And, even if they would say like, oh, I didn't like this bit or I really like that bit, I think we would listen more to our own observations. And there's a lot of things that we learned from this process. We saw that everybody touches the screen differently. And we had to put a lot of effort into kind of predicting what people really meant when they were swiping really fast. We found that people would focus on a very small area of the screen, usually around Ida. And so we would have to make sure that if something happened on the other side of the screen, we'd have to, play a big animation or something to get them to notice. We found that if we put too many ideas onto one screen, like too much gameplay, it wouldn't feel as nice. It'd feel cluttered. We couldn't make as nice of a composition. And people would have to do a lot of work just to advance one or two little squares. So we ended up thinking that it's much better to just put one idea at a time on a screen. We found that people didn't respond really well to just puzzles made out of blocks. But once you dress those blocks up as bridges and arches and towers, suddenly it had a sense of place. It had a sense of story that worked much better. We found that people would get fatigued by the game quite easily. I don't know if it's because a lot of who we tested with were not core gamers. They didn't consider themselves to be gamers. And so we had to just make sure that a level would end every 10 to 15 minutes to give people a chance to take a break and maybe close down the game and take a rest for a while before coming back. We also found that for a lot of people, difficult puzzles aren't really fun. As I said, it was really painful to watch people get frustrated, and they wanted to be involved because of the art and the story, but the puzzles were preventing them, was punishing them from trying to access this experience. So, we learned that there was a certain threshold for like trying to give people just enough challenge, but let them not get stuck. We learned so much from this process. Here's a couple of the very early levels that we built that we learned so many lessons from. Just like how to navigate from one screen of a level to another, how much puzzles to put on the screen, how you need to dress it up and reward the player when they've done something right. I think the first few months of the project was just full of us learning how to make a good Monument Valley level. We also had to learn how to tell a story in a way that fit Monument Valley. So in the middle there is us trying to tell a story through these frescoes, trying to tell the history of Monument Valley. At the top right, there's an interaction that we tried. Originally, the companion character of Ida was a dodecahedron. And then it turned out it wasn't much fun to roll a ball around the screen, and so that eventually became the totem. In the bottom right is the original ending for the game. And I think we had this really great story with this great twist at the end, and we thought that this was going to be really great to deliver to audiences. And we found that it was just a bit too convoluted. It was too complex for what the game experience was. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we had to cut that. I think at some point we realized that what we were making was a minimalist game. Not just minimalist in terms of the visuals, but throughout the whole game design. We found, I think we kind of knew from the start that we had an emphasis on quality over quantity. And that meant cutting out anything that we didn't need, right? Cutting out the fat. What that means is every little thing counts. We have to care about every single pixel. Every single unit of geometry changes the experience. Every gesture counts. All of these things together, when I was thinking about that, I thought, you know what we're trying to achieve in every puzzle is elegance. I think in every screen of Monument Valley, there's three elements at play. There's the interaction, there's the architecture, and there's the graphic composition on the screen. And none of those elements could kind of outshadow the others. Even if we had a really great puzzle, if that made the screen a mess, it just wasn't elegant. So elegance was achieved when all of these three things were working together. As I said at the start, we learned so much from Windowsill about how you could make a different kind of experience and not have to adopt the tropes of existing games in our game history. But towards the end of the project, when we were running out of time, and we were really trying to make this game be the best it could be, I think we really, really had to let go of some of the things that we were still hanging on to. And as I mentioned, the first was what we thought was a really good story arc. When we simplified it down into what's currently in the game, we were worried that was a little bit too simplistic for people. But it turns out that it was actually quite fitting. We were worried for a long time that core gamers would demand more challenging, more difficult puzzles. I'm sure some of you here would agree with them. And for a long time, we had this idea to make a bunch of more difficult challenge levels that used a cheaper art style to save time, kind of like the VR missions for the original Metal Gear Solid. But we thought, as we're running out of time, that these extra levels, they weren't really in the same spirit of the rest of the game. They didn't have that same balance and care and attention to them. So that was easier to let go. What was harder to let go of was secrets. We're all big Zelda fans on the team, and we love the idea of secret doors, secret passages, secret rooms, and the mythology that could bring. But we tried secrets, and people ended up being really distracted by chasing down clues and trying to find out what this alternate path was for. And so they got distracted from the main quest. We also didn't really know what the secrets were actually going to be. We didn't have any extra story to give out. Collectibles were kind of against the themes of the game. And it just seemed in the end that we were trying to add secrets for the sake of adding secrets. The last thing that we let go of, and I think the hardest thing for the team, was this idea that the longer you spend in a game, the higher the value. Originally, we thought we were going to complete 20 levels. And then that got cut down to 12, and then 10, which in playtesting averaged out at 90 minutes. And we're really worried about this, can we sell a game that only lasts 90 minutes long? And then we thought to ourselves, you know what? In our busy lives, not all of us have the time to spend tens, hundreds of hours in a game. What if instead of trying to stretch out the experience as long as possible, we said what we wanted to say as elegantly as possible and let the player get on with their lives? And so the final value proposition is 90 minutes. And I think by the end we were trying to respect the player's time, right? To just give them the best, all killer, no filler. I think one of the achievements that I'm proudest about the game is that we made a game that normal people can complete. It's quite an easy game. It's a very linear game. It's a short game, but that means that non-gamers, right, mums, dads, girlfriends, boyfriends, kids who haven't been introduced to games yet, they're able to complete it. And isn't that an interesting notion that these days it takes so long and so much effort just to get to the end of a story, to get to the end of an experience? And again, we thought that there was no version of this game that was going to work for freemium. So we ended up with this price point of $3.99 US. And that was our value proposition, 90 minutes, $4. Crazy, right? As I said, in the mobile app space, the common wisdom is that it's all about the freemium. So how did this crazy experiment go? Well, I'm happy to say that the critical reception went really well. The most sublime hour my iPad has ever given me, and the value of such a thing is incalculable. Kotaku. I'm so proud that we made Kotaku write poetry. Stayed with me like a dream I didn't want to forget. Stuns with its serenity. Each screen is a work of art. And we flipped out when we got this tweet. Monument Valley is the most elegant game I've ever played. Tim Schafer, one of our heroes. In June, we got one of these things. This is an Apple Design Award, which Apple gives to a handful of apps. This year, they give it to 5 games at WWDC. Turns out it's very hard to get a photograph of an aluminium cube. And we're really, really happy to say that it's done well financially as well. We made the costs of the project back in about a week. And after 4 months, we hit 1 million sales. Now, that doesn't make us rich by any measure, but we made our money back, and it means that the team can stay together and make another crazy project with complete creative freedom. This is all we ever really wanted, right? Not to be rich, but to be sustainable. Interestingly, we're not alone. In the same month that we released, April 2014, Hitman Go, FTL, and Leo's Fortune all came out as premium apps. And it's really interesting to see Apple support all of these games. Actually, all 5 of the Apple Design Award winners were premium games. But the response that I'm most satisfied, most happy about, is a bit harder to quantify. We've received hundreds of tweets and emails from people who say they never play games, they're not gamers, but they enjoyed and finished Monument Valley. For many of them, this is the first game that they've ever finished. We hear from parents who write in proud that their 3-year-old can play Monument Valley, or that their 6-year-old can complete it by themselves without help. We hear from other people who are complaining that they can't get their iPad back from their mom and dad. We've heard people call Monument Valley not a game, but a work of art. We hear from people who have cried at the end. People are amazed that a video game could make them feel like this. Like that a game could be about beauty and delight. I'm really interested that Monument Valley helps people talk about games in a different way. And, looking at this, I don't think we're the first by any measure. I think we're part of this movement of games that are really focused around just doing something small and something beautiful, and perhaps getting to the end in a respectful time in order to maximize their emotional impact or tell a really good story without having to kind of fight against the mechanics. I think the more that you think about what we do as experiences, you have to consider the whole experience about the game, starting with the branding and discovery, the icon of the game, the name of the game, the packaging, how people discover it, whether you hear about it from a friend or you see it on an ad on Facebook or you read it in a review in the New York Times. I think the value proposition is important, right? What does it mean when you say that this game is free? Or what does a subscription entail? What does a Kickstarter entail? What is this expectation of continual updates or continuous service? How does that affect the overall experience? I think when you enter a game and you start off with the menus and introduction cinematics, people think of that as the wrapper for the game. But I think that's where it starts. That's minutes of the user's time. That's part of the content itself. So only once you get through all of these things do you get to what we usually consider to be the meat of the game, the mechanics, the aesthetics, the semantics. Over multiple play sessions, the feedback that we give the player and their ongoing sense of progression forms sort of a longer loop, the longer sense of the experience of the game. And originally, this was the end of the list. This was the list of what I had for what comprises a game experience. But I didn't think that this summed up exactly what Monument Valley was about. I thought there was something missing. And I think what Monument Valley means to a lot of people, right, what we hear from audiences, is a lot about what happens after they've stopped playing. I think it's about what we leave in hearts and minds. More than just the absence of boredom. What do they go on thinking about? What have we made them feel during this experience? So coming back to the original question of what our team asked ourselves about what we're trying to achieve when we're making games, I think we're trying to have left something in hearts and minds. Something perhaps like a mythology to inspire future generations. Or maybe moments of awe and beauty, or a sense of discovery and delight. Or maybe some understanding about the world we live in, or an insight into life and death, or what it's like to fall in love. Thank you. I think hopefully we have some time for some questions. This guy's running with the microphone. Gotta wait for him, I guess.
Thank you. A question about classification and turning the tide. I mean, the problem right now is if you look at iTunes, you can buy books, and people gladly play out a couple of bucks for a book or a movie, and still they find a hard time paying the same front up for an experience, an interaction experience. Do you think when more products like this come out, it will turn the tide? Also, maybe companies like Netflix, other stuff with more look not into games, but more the interactive experience and what can happen in this field both for discovery and also be able to sell the product.
Right. Turning the tide against freemium back to premium. Like, will people pay for these things? That's your question, right? It's part of it is the system. Apple and Google, they manage the stores. They can change so much by changing the way that they do featuring and the way that people can discover new things. I do think that it's difficult, but it is possible, like we did, to give people a value proposition of, you know what, this costs a bit more than maybe what you're used to, but it's going to be worth it, right? A lot of the tweets that we see, some of them are people complaining, like, I spent $4 for this. But we see so many people that say, you know what, it was worth every penny. And I try to get everybody I know to play it. And the reason that they're saying that is because we gave them something to talk about. It's not just matching colored gems. It's not about trying to kill as many people as possible. That's fun. That's great. And it's great we have those things. But it's not necessarily inspiring people. I don't want to have to bribe people to tell their friends about it. So if you can create love, if you can create a love for Star Wars and a love for Harry Potter, why can't you do that in game? We do that. We have a traditional model of games. Things are changing, but I think that we don't all have to follow the beat of that freemium drum. It's, if you create something that has value, I think people will pay for it. Next question. Oh, this guy.
Hi.
Hi.
You talked a little bit about how you found that mechanics can often obstruct the message you're trying to deliver. And I was wondering if you could maybe touch upon how you think the mechanics and the interaction in Monument Valley were actually conducive to the message you were trying to leave in Hearts and Minds type thing.
Oh, that's a great question. I think the way that we present the mechanics, for example, not giving any instructions, I think that has a certain attitude to it, that it's not condescending. We're not going to say, like, click on this button here, now click on this here, and then, do this for 3 minutes. And then, here's 3 stars just for doing what we said. That's treating people a bit like an idiot. So with our mechanics, sometimes we put you on a screen and there's a thing that you haven't seen before. We don't say anything about that. And then you play with it, and something happens and you're like, oh, that's interesting. I think that's more in the spirit of play and about what games should be about working things out for themselves, because when people do that, they feel smarter, and they're surprised when something nice happens after that. So I think that's a way of framing a mechanic, designing a mechanic that results in a certain type of experience. You can't die in Monument Valley. There's no fail state. So that says something, right? There's nothing you can really do wrong in Monument Valley. Just like when I put the labyrinth and the maze up. Some people love mazes. They love really challenging, brutal games. They get off on being punished over and over again, and that's fantastic. We should always make games like that, because there'll always be an audience for that. But there's people like me who, nowadays I want to get to the themes. I want to get to the art and the story and learning something and finding out about how human beings work together. And I hate having to be shot in the head 70 times just to get there. Wow, so many hands. Great.
Hi, Ken. Thanks for the talk.
You're welcome.
I have a question about accessibility and playtest. So seemingly the game was very easy to access and to understand from anyone, but still did you find sometimes players struggling on the game for any reason during playtest?
Oh yeah,
And
absolutely.
how did you, when you encounter problems in playtest, how did you address them to improve the game?
So the question is, did we find problems with players not knowing what to do or getting stuck when we play tested? That's why we play test. We did it over and over from as early as possible and then constantly throughout the project. And the earliest tests went horrible. People they couldn't figure out what to do. They got stuck. They got exhausted. They're like, can I go now? And we're like, no. And they're like, it's beautiful, but I'm really frustrated or bored or whatever. And I think we just had to like find out what was good about it and what they didn't like. And we talk about it and debate it and just try again. And over time, we learned things about how it's UX really. It's about how people see and touch this thing. And sometimes it's an iPad, sometimes it's an iPhone. That makes a difference. And sometimes they'd get stuck, and we would see and watch how long they'd get stuck for. You know, if it's just a couple of minutes, that's okay, right? Because then if they find it, they're like, I feel smart now, and that's the best. You know, when you can give them an obstacle, and they feel like they've achieved something when they've done it. Obviously, I mean, there's this sense that Monument Valley is barely a game and it's really easy. But some people find it very hard, actually. Some people take 4 hours to complete Monument Valley. And that's not because they're bad human beings. It's just because they haven't played games for 10 or 20 years, and maybe they don't have, you know, really highly developed senses of 3D space, and maybe they're not familiar with mathematics and geometry. And I don't want to have to exclude that experience from them. We consciously wanted to target a really broad experience. So some people will find it very easy, and I hope that they still enjoyed the art and the story and everything else. And I'm so glad that kids and so many young girls, I mean, I think that's wonderful that young girls can get into Monument Valley and see like, oh, here's a game that is not forcing me to kill people and is not punishing me and has a princess who's not a stereotypical princess. You know, I'm so glad that possibly Monument Valley might inspire some young girls to get into the field of game design. Next question. I think this guy's been waiting a long time. Is that right? Yeah? Could we do him? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm curious about the visual aesthetics of the game, and could you elaborate a little bit more about the choices you made in terms of color usage, shape language, and composition?
Sure. I wish I could give a whole nother GDC presentation about the visuals of the game. How can I talk quickly about it? It's kind of minimalist, so very flat shaded. So every little thing matters, right? We you know, spent a long time just zooming in and staring at the screen, and it's like, why is there this little artifact there? You know, how do we get our light mapping correct? When I first started as an art director, I thought about what I wanted to do, how I would do it, and just put it out there. And that's kind of the opposite of user experience. User experience is about what do you see when you see the screen. It doesn't matter what I was thinking originally or what I intended. It's about what ends up in your mind and in your eyes. And I like to think that I'm much better at that now. So I think about how are you going to see this world? You know, when do I light the top surface? Do I light the sides? If I give you if I put a doorway at the end of a long path, what does that mean to you? I guess I'm talking about level design now, but in my head it's all kind of tied together. We wrote our own shaders for Monument Valley because I think like an illustrator, which means if I want the top surface of the cubes to be perfectly yellow, that's what I want, exactly yellow. And so it's hard when you have a light acting on it at a certain angle and that interpolates with the environment light and everything. I just wanted to apply color directly. So our shader is not true lighting at all. It actually applies one color to the top, one color to the left, one color to the right of the cube that you can see. And then there's another light for the back, another color. And it's all interpolated and it's really complex maths. But I mean, that's a way that we used, that I kind of approached the art using my technical background, you know, well, obviously with the programmers as well. The color palettes, we've had a lot of really great response about the color, but it wasn't really intended. I mean, the way that I work is I try a bunch of stuff and hope it works out, and then I just keep tweaking it and tweaking it. You know, the really basic tip is warm and cool. If you put warm colors next to cool colors, that looks awesome. You put gradients on it, it looks awesome. And so every screen in Monument Valley is just tweaked with warms and cools and gradients until it looks nice. I think the very abstract world allows for a lot of unrealistic colors, so that we had a lot of flexibility there. If you track me down later, I can talk for another 3 hours about the art of Monument Valley. Do we have time for more? Yeah, one more? Okay. Look at that guy. He looks so confident.
Okay, so first off, great talk.
Thank you.
So you described the design process for this interactive experience, but like you said, there were some people that consider it to be a work of art.
That's sorry?
That this game is a work of art.
Oh, yeah.
And I was just wondering, do you consider yourself to be an artist in the traditional classical sense?
Uh-huh.
And do you consider Monument Valley to be art?
Sure. Do I consider myself to be an artist in the classical sense, and do I consider Monument Valley to be art? Who here thinks that games are art? Great. That's the majority of you guys. That's awesome. Who here is a programmer or a developer? Sometimes. So, I mean, if you guys are working on art, you're artists, right? I think of the whole game development team as artists, because we're all creating art. The decisions that you make as a programmer, right, like how to create systems, how are you going to enable things for other people, I think that's art. So I think of myself as an artist in both senses. When I create visual art, concept art, and illustrations, I'm an artist. But also when I design computer games and when I write scripts and when I do level design, I also think of myself as creating art. I do think that games are art, or at least some games.
Thanks.
You're welcome. I'm going to be here all week, so if any of the rest of you have questions, I would love to talk to you more about Monument Valley and experiences. Thank you so much for listening.